Hello, this is Pastor Goodman, and as I said last week, I want to begin a Thursday regular sort of video blogcast, and this week I want to begin what will be a multi-week engagement with Paul's letter to the Romans. Now, you can sort of think of this as a Bible study. You can think of it as maybe a verse-by-verse Bible study because I intend to sort of read through a chapter each week, stopping at various points and trying to shed some light onto what those words might be saying to us. Now, I want to begin by sort of giving the introduction to the book of Romans. Not going to be a detailed introduction, not going to be maybe the best introduction you've ever heard, but it's going to be one that maybe to help will set the scene. And I'm relying heavily on a study Bible that I found in the last year called the Modern Life Study Bible. It gives some terrific insights if you want to pick one up yourself. The only drawback is to me at least, is that it's the New King James Version. I would like to have the same sort of teachings, but maybe with another version. New King James is a whole lot better in terms of understanding than the King James, but still it becomes a little stilted at times the way that the New King James renders the text that I'll be reading compared to, say, the New International or the New Revised Standard or the New Century Version, all of which are some of my other favorites to choose from. But this particular study Bible only comes in the New King James. So keep that in mind as we go through the study as well. You'll see me sort of looking off camera every now and then. I'm going to be looking at some notes and other things. So I hope that you will take the time to join in on these broadcasts. Now, they may be a little bit longer than a 4 or 5 minute broadcast. I'm going to try to keep them in no longer than 15 or 20 minutes. But think of this as a Bible study. Get your Bible out, follow along, take some notes, and see what maybe you can learn as I attempt to share some of these thoughts with you. Let's begin now with an introduction to the book of Romans. As you know, the book of Romans is one of those New Testament letters that we know was penned by the Apostle Paul. And when you think about the book of Romans, you're looking at a book that helps to explain the core of our Christian faith. If you were to think of Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and the book of Acts, and if you would think of what they were trying to do, you could see them as sort of being the story of Jesus' life and the story of how the early church moved out into the world, especially in the book of Acts. And so those are trying to outline a narrative. When we get to Paul's letter to the Romans, we're not looking at narrative anymore. Instead, we're looking at Paul as he attempts to focus in this rather long letter on what Jesus' message was all about. Remember, the first 5 books talked about Jesus' story. Now we're looking at the specifics of the message of Jesus as it's being interpreted by Paul, a Pharisee, a scholar of the law. And so you're going to get into some rather detailed kinds of concepts. You're going to be looking at some things that sometimes make you go, I'm not sure what that exactly means. And even as I've looked at it, I sometimes wonder, what is it that was really going on? But the gospel, when we think about what the message of Jesus is all about, we think about the gospel, and we have to understand that the gospel is more than just a series of good deeds. The gospel is more than just a set of morals by which we need to live our life. The gospel itself is truth, because the gospel is what God has revealed his plan to us through. And when we look at the book of Romans, we see that Paul is attempting to explore a question and attempting to answer that question in one sense or another. And the question is simply this: why did Jesus have to die? A good question. Took him an entire letter to the Romans to sort of answer that in many ways. And as we go through the book, I hope you will begin to look at it in those kinds of terms. But Paul was talking to a church that was not Jewish, more than likely, or if it was Jewish in a setting in which the Roman world, the secular world, was impinging upon the church. It had its own set of morals and values, shall we say, and Paul is trying to convince these people, these Jews and these Gentiles, that there is another way in which you need to live your life. And it's through Jesus' death and his resurrection that those things make all the difference. And as I said earlier, Paul is using his training to analyze some of those complex theological issues. He's trying to break them down into parts that are more easily digestible. And the answer to that question as to why did Jesus die, it makes a lot of complexity. It creates a lot of questions that a Jewish audience would have, because they were looking for Messiah and they wanted to see how Jesus fit in with this understanding of what Messiah was all about, and to a Gentile audience, because they had no clue what Messiah was. They had no clue that God was working through the Jews. They had no real understanding of what it was that Jesus came to accomplish, or what God's plan for the world through Jesus Christ was all about. Well, when we look at Romans, we see that it can give us a big picture of what God's salvation is all about. And we see that God's salvation is not limited, shall we say. First of all, God's salvation impacts every aspect of our lives. It's not simply personal. It's not simply private. It's also a public statement. It's a universal salvation that's offered to anyone that wants to come, to anyone that wants to experience what God has done. And in one sense, it's very relevant, the way Paul deals with it, to government, to science, to technology even, and even the system upon which the world itself is built, because God sometimes, it seems, works through those things. God uses the system that's here to in one sense contrast, and to in another sense to help us in our proclamation, because one of the things that's there is the great Roman system, reaching throughout the world at that time in such a way that we were able to use the technology for our benefit. We were able to use the roads of Rome. We were able to use the opportunities to gather in the Colosseums and the other places, the amphitheaters, and proclaim the gospel. And so when we talk about God's salvation, it impacted the entire life of individuals and of communities and of the world itself. We also see that Paul seems to indicate that the salvation that God presents to the world is something that's available in all times and in all places. You see, the gospel sort of has its beginnings from the very beginning. God had a plan. We messed up that plan. God had another plan, luckily. And God was able to have that good news of what Jesus would be able to do to be woven into the very fabric of what the Old Testament turned out to be, as well as into the very fabric of the world as well. Christ becomes the culmination, the final piece that puts everything together again. He's the one that weaves through his life and his death and his resurrection a new understanding of what God has meant for us to have in our lives from the very beginning. You see, God is carrying out his plan at all times, in all places, from the very beginning of the foundation of the world up until the present day of Paul, and on into the present day in which we find ourselves today. When we talk about salvation in Romans, we also have to understand that it includes all kinds of people. The gospel is one of those things that sweeps throughout history, from the creation to Christ to the end of the world, but it also is meant for Jews, the chosen ones of God, but it's also meant for the Gentiles, those that are sort of grafted into the family, those that were not part of the grand story of the Old Testament, so to speak. Paul understands that this gospel is for men, it is for women, it is for those that are powerless as well as those that are powerful. The gospel is for those that are good, and the gospel is for those that are bad. As Paul understands it, the gospel is available for all people. It's not just limited to a certain group. It's not just set aside so that only a few can experience it, but indeed it is universal so that everyone can partake in the gospel, and in partaking in the gospel find the salvation that God has planned. In this particular letter, Paul mentions the church at Rome, but he is speaking to a sort of a general readership, it seems. Now, Paul didn't start the church at Rome, and at the time of the writing, we are pretty sure that he's never yet visited the city. He's intended to stop over in Rome, however, on the way to Spain, and we see his reference to it in those passages later in the book. We also can read about Rome in Acts chapter 28. But while we know few specifics about Paul's readers in Rome, we don't know exactly who they were. We don't know where the church met. We're not sure who all the people were, although at the end of the letter we hear praise for certain folks that were active there. Although we can't know their details, there's one thing that we do know, and that's Rome itself, and the influence that Rome had not just on the region, but the world at that time, extending from Britain to parts of Africa, from Spain to Persia. It was an enormous empire, and it was governed by what were called provincial governors, sometimes petty kings, sometimes vassals of Rome. They imposed what they called the Pax Romana, meaning the Roman peace. And to help them enforce that peace, they had a very superior road system that allowed them to get from place to place for trade, but also to get the soldiers there in case the peace was disturbed. And one thing you can say about the Romans is that they were in love with power. When you think about the government, Rome's government, when you think about their economy, when you think about their infrastructure, when you think about their defense systems, they were very formidable, and they had built their empire to last. Hopefully for them, they thought thousands of years. Maybe that's why Paul begins his letter, his description of the gospel, in terms of power, in terms of God's power to save them. You'll hear that specifically mentioned in chapter 1, verse 16, when we get to that next week. But when we look at Rome, we see that Rome was a place in which the Caesars, well, they were treated as gods on earth. They had dominion. They ruled over places far away, territories. They had people. But the book of Romans does something different. It affirms that Christ is the supreme Lord, that Christ is the one that's in charge, even though these Roman powerful senators and Caesars didn't understand that. Paul is asserting that Jesus Christ is the one that's in charge of all of creation, even the Roman government, even the Roman system. Christ is the one that's over all the nations. Christ is the one that has the true power, and the true power comes through what God did through Jesus Christ in his death and in his resurrection. And so we find Paul writing a letter to the people of Rome. I hope you'll come back next week as we go verse by verse through chapter 1 of Paul's letter to the Romans, and I will try to share some insights along the way as to maybe what the verses will be. I'll start trying to spell out what some of the themes are that are beginning to emerge as we move through the letter. And 16 weeks later, if my calculations are right, we'll have finished Romans. And then I will probably pick another book of the New Testament, maybe a shorter one this time, a Galatians or an Ephesians. But I'm going to work my way through them this way, giving you a chance to come and to have this Bible study with me Even if you can't make it to church, even if you don't live in Big Stone Gap, you can maybe learn. And maybe the gospel can speak to you and change your life. God bless. I hope to see you back here next Thursday. Better yet, let me see you in church on Sunday and tell me how God is moving in your life. God bless.